The summer of 1898 had settled over Wyoming like a heavy quilt, warm and still when Daniel Hawthorne sat down with his grandson on the porch of the ranch house he had built with his own hands. The old man was 69 now, his hair gone silver at the temples, his face lined with the kind of creases that come from squinting into prairie sun for half a century. But his eyes were still clear, still that same hazel that had seen too much war and too much wonder to ever look at the world the same way twice. Jonathan was 18, tall and eager in the way young men are when they think they understand courage. He was leaving in the morning, boarding a train that would take him to war with Spain, and he had that look in his eye that Daniel recognized from his own youth. The look that said the world was simple, that right and wrong were as clear as the division between earth and sky, that being a man meant being willing to fight and die for something bigger than yourself. Daniel had thought those things once. The war had taught him different. He poured 2 fingers of whiskey into a glass, passed it to his grandson, and settled back in his chair. The sun was just beginning its slow descent toward the mountains, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. From inside the house came the sounds of family of grandchildren playing and daughters-in-law preparing a supper of the kind of life Daniel had never imagined possible when he was Jonathan's age. "You think you understand honor," Daniel said, his voice carrying that gravel that comes from decades of Wyoming wind. "You think you know what it means to be a man. Going off to war, fighting for your country, all of that. And those things matter, Jonathan. They do. But before you go, I want to tell you about a different kind of courage. About the kind of man who saves someone when the whole world is trying to sell them." He pointed down at the porch beneath their feet. The wood was worn smooth from 25 years of boots and bare feet of children running and lovers walking slow in the evening cool. Right under this spot, buried 6 feet deep in Wyoming earth, there's an iron collar, the kind they put on animals. Except it wasn't on an animal. It was welded around the throat of a 21-year-old woman named Clara Morgan. And this is the story of how I met your grandmother and what I learned about what it really means to be a man. The whiskey sat untouched in Jonathan's hand. He leaned forward and Daniel began. It was July of 1872 and Daniel Hawthorne was 25 years old. He had already lived enough for 2 lifetimes. The war had taken him at 17, eager and stupid, the way boys are when drums start beating and flags start waving. He had fought for the Union at Shiloh, where the Tennessee River ran red and the peach orchard bloomed pink with blossoms that fell on bodies stacked like cordwood. A mini-A ball had shattered his left shin, and the field surgeon had wanted to take the leg. Daniel had refused, lived through the infection on whiskey and spite, and limped home with an honorable discharge and a leg that ached whenever rain was coming. He had taken his army pay, every cent of it, and bought this land. 160 acres of Wyoming territory under the Homestead Act, raw and wild and his. He had cut every log for the cabin himself, notched them with an axe until his hands bled, raised the walls alone because there was no one left to help him. His parents were dead of cholera. His sister was gone in a way that was worse than death. He was alone, but he was free. Or at least he thought he was, until the day he rode into Fort Laramie for supplies and saw them selling a human being like livestock. The town was busy that July afternoon, the kind of busy that comes with payday and good weather. Cowboys from the surrounding ranches crowded the saloons. Merchants hawked their wares from storefronts that still smelled of fresh pine, and somewhere a blacksmith's hammer rang against an anvil in steady rhythm. Daniel had come for rope and ammunition, the mundane necessities of ranch life. He had not come looking for anything that would change his life forever. But then he heard the crowd. It was the kind of noise that pulls at you, that mixture of excitement and ugliness that means something is happening that should not be happening, but everyone is watching anyway. Daniel followed the sound to the main street, where a crowd of maybe 40 men had gathered in front of the general store. And there, standing on a raised platform like she was a mare being shown for breeding, was Clara Morgan. Daniel would remember every detail of that moment for the rest of his life. The way the sun struck the iron collar around her neck, making it gleam dull and cruel against her skin. The way her dark auburn hair hung limp and tangled past her shoulders, unwashed and uncared for. The way her thin cotton dress was stained with sweat and dirt and torn at the hem. The way her blue eyes were completely empty, like she had gone somewhere deep inside herself where no one could reach her. But it was the collar that stopped Daniel's heart in his chest. It was maybe 3 inches wide, welded shut with no lock, no key, No way to remove it except by cutting through the metal itself. It had rubbed her neck raw in places, the skin beneath red and weeping. It proclaimed to everyone who saw her that she was not a person. She was property. She was owned. Daniel felt something old and terrible rise up in his throat, a taste like copper and ash. His hands clenched into fists so tight his knuckles went white. Because when he looked at that girl with the iron collar around her throat, he did not see a stranger. He saw his sister Margaret. Jonathan interrupted, then his young voice cutting through the memory. Aunt Margaret, the one who died when she was young. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes distant with old pain. Your great aunt. She was 2 years younger than me. Smart as a whip, beautiful, full of life. When I was 20 and she was 18, cholera came through our town. Took our parents in the span of a week. Left us with nothing. No money, no family willing to take us in. I tried to find work, tried to keep us fed, but it was never enough. He paused, took a long drink of his whiskey. Margaret got a job in a saloon to help make ends meet. I thought it would be fine. I thought I could protect her. I promised her I would protect her, looked her straight in the eye, and gave her my word. The words came harder now, each one pulled from some deep well of guilt that 26 years had never managed to drain. The saloon owner was a man named Pritchard. He started telling Margaret she owed him money. Room and board, he said, interest compounding. All made up, all lies, but she had no way to prove it. Before I understood what was happening, he had sold her contract to a man heading west to San Francisco. I found out. I tried to stop it. Got into a fight with 3 of Pritchard's men. Daniel's hand unconsciously went to his ribs, where the scars from that beating still ached in cold weather. They beat me until I could not stand. Beat me until I could not see. I woke up 2 days later in an alley and Margaret was gone. Just gone like she had never existed. Like she had been erased from the world. I spent 5 years looking for her. Daniel continued, his voice rough. Went to San Francisco, asked questions in every brothel, every gambling den, every place where women disappeared and no one cared enough to look for them. Put up handbills with her picture, hired a private detective with the last of my money. Found nothing, not a single trace. He looked at Jonathan with eyes that had seen too much. I think she died out there alone and afraid. And I think she died believing I had abandoned her when she needed me most. That is what I have to live with. That is the promise I broke. The sun had dropped lower while Daniel spoke, and the shadows on the porch had grown long. So when I saw that girl standing in the Fort Laramie street with an iron collar around her neck, I saw Margaret, and I knew that if I walked away, I would be failing my sister all over again. I had to at least try to save one person, even if I had been too late to save the one who mattered most. Daniel fell silent, and in that silence, Jonathan could hear the weight of 26 years of carrying that guilt. Then the old man straightened, pulled himself back to the story, back to that July day in 1872, when everything changed. The auctioneer was a pot-bellied man with tobacco-stained teeth and the kind of voice that carried over crowds. He stood next to Clara on the platform, one meaty hand gripping her upper arm like she might try to run. She would not have gotten far. Her wrists were bound together in front of her with coarse rope that had rubbed the skin raw and bleeding. Name's Clara Morgan, the auctioneer bellowed. Strong back good with cooking and cleaning, young enough to bear children. We'll start the bidding at $50. Daniel watched Clara's face as the auctioneer spoke. She kept her eyes down, refused to look at the men gathered around her. But her jaw was clenched tight and her bound hands were fisted like she was ready to swing at someone. She was terrified. That was obvious, but she was also angry. She had not been broken yet, not completely, and that mattered more than Daniel could have explained. $50, called out a merchant Daniel recognized from previous trips to town. The man had greedy eyes and soft hands and a reputation for using his household staff badly. 60, countered a rancher whose massive hands looked like they had crushed things before and would again. Clara's body went rigid. Daniel could see her calculating, could see her mind racing through possibilities. Could she run? With her wrist bound and the collar marking her as owned property, she would not make it 10 feet before someone dragged her back. The territory had laws about runaways, and those laws were not written to protect women like her. Daniel felt his heart hammering in his chest, felt the old familiar tightness from the war, The feeling of standing on a battlefield and knowing that the next few seconds would determine whether you lived or died. He had 3 months' wages in his pocket, money he had been saving to buy lumber for expanding the cabin, to purchase breeding stock for improving his herd. Money that represented months of back-breaking work and careful planning. But what was money compared to a life? $100. His voice cut through the bidding like a knife through silk. The crowd went quiet, heads turning to see who had spoken. Even Clara looked up for the first time, her empty blue eyes finding his face across the distance. Daniel stepped forward through the crowd. He was dressed like what he was, a working cowboy who had built everything he owned with his own hands. Dusty denim pants worn pale at the knees, a chambray shirt with the sleeves rolled up over forearms corded with muscle, leather boots that had seen 1,000 miles of Wyoming territory, a hat that had kept sun and rain off his head for 5 years and looked it. There was nothing special about him, nothing to mark him as different from any of the other men gathered to watch a woman be sold. But when Clara looked at him, Daniel made sure to look back at her face, not at her body, not at the collar, at her eyes, at the person trapped behind them, the way you would look at someone who mattered. The auctioneer's eyes lit up with greed. $100 was a fortune, more than most cowboys made in 3 months of hard labor. 100 from Daniel Hawthorne, he called out, voice rising with excitement. Do I hear 110? The merchant, who had bid 50, shook his head and walked away, already calculating that his desire was not worth that much money. The rancher with the crushing hands looked angry, but he too fell silent. $100 was too rich for his blood. Going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. He paused for dramatic effect, scanning the crowd for any last-minute bidders. Sold to Daniel Hawthorne for $100. Daniel counted out the money in gold coins, each one representing long days of sweat and isolation and work that left him too exhausted to dream. The auctioneer snatched them up eagerly, tested each one between his teeth to make sure they were genuine, and then gestured toward Clara like she was a horse being handed over to her new owner. Clara felt something inside her break a little more. It did not matter that this man had kind eyes. Men with kind eyes could still be monsters when they got you alone. She had learned that lesson too many times to ever forget it. But then Daniel did something she did not expect. He stepped forward and pulled a knife from his belt. Clara flinched instinctively, her body tensing for violence, every muscle preparing for the pain she knew was coming. She had seen men pull knives before, seen what they could do with them, seen how they liked to make you afraid before they made you hurt. But Daniel did not grab her hair, did not press the blade against her throat, did not do any of the 1,000 things Clara had learned to expect from men who owned her. Instead, he carefully cut the ropes binding her wrists. The rough hemp fell away, and Clara stood there staring at her freed hands like they belonged to someone else. The skin beneath was raw and bleeding where the rope had bitten deep. Daniel looked at the wounds with an expression that might have been anger, though not at her. You're going to bleed if we don't clean those, he said quietly. His voice was surprisingly gentle for a man his size, like he was talking to a spooked horse instead of a woman he had just purchased. Clara could not speak, could not process what was happening. Every man who had ever bought her had immediately established dominance, had made it clear what her purpose was, had taken what they paid for. But Daniel Hawthorne just stood there with a knife in his hand, waiting for something she could not name. Can you walk? He asked. Clara nodded mutely, not trusting her voice. My horses are at the livery. We have a ride ahead of us. He turned and started walking, and after a moment of confusion, Clara followed. She kept one hand near her throat, touching the collar, compulsively reminded with every step that she was marked property, that everyone who saw her knew what she was. Women looked at her with pity or disgust. Men looked with curiosity or contempt. She kept her eyes on the ground, following Daniel's boot prints in the dust. At the livery stable, 2 horses stood saddled and ready, a large chestnut gelding that was obviously Daniel's and a smaller bay mare. Daniel gestured to the bay. You can ride? Yes. Clara's voice was hoarse from disuse. Her last owner had not allowed her to speak unless spoken to, had beaten her the one time she tried. Good, it's about 15 miles to my ranch. We should make it before dark. He helped her mount his hands, impersonal and efficient, and then swung up onto his own horse. They rode out of Fort Laramie, heading northeast, and Clara tried to memorize the route in case she needed to run. The Wyoming landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills covered with sagebrush and wild grass mountains rising in the distance like sentinels guarding the edge of the world. The sky was so vast it made Clara feel insignificant, but also somehow free in a way she had not felt in years. Out here there were no walls, no locked doors, no rooms that became prisons. They rode in silence for over an hour. Clara's mind raced with dark possibilities, each one worse than the last. Maybe Daniel did not want to establish his ownership in public. Maybe he was taking her somewhere isolated where no one would hear her scream. Maybe he was one of those men who liked to play gentle before showing his true nature. She had met those men before. Sometimes they were the worst ones. Finally, as the sun started to sink toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Daniel slowed his horse to a walk. Clara did the same, her muscles tense with anxiety. Her hand unconsciously moving to the pocket where she had hidden a sharp stone she had picked up near the livery. It would not be much of a weapon, but it was something. "That collar," Daniel said without looking at her. "Did Ashford put that on you?" Clara's hand went instinctively to her throat, fingers tracing the hated metal. "Yes." "Does it have a lock?" "No." Her voice was barely a whisper. "It's welded shut." Daniel was quiet for a moment, and Clara saw his jaw tighten, saw something dark and angry flash across his face. But when he spoke, his voice was controlled. "When we get to the ranch, I'm going to cut it off. I want you to know that ahead of time, so you're not frightened when I come at you with metal cutters." Clara's breath caught in her chest. Her hand tightened on the reins. "Why? Because no human being should wear a collar like a dog." His voice was hard with anger, but Clara sensed it was not directed at her. "Because what Ashford did was wrong, and I will not have it on my land." She did not know what to say to that. Every response that came to mind seemed inadequate or dangerous. So she said nothing, and they continued riding as the sun dipped lower and the air grew cooler and the shadows grew longer across the prairie. Daniel's ranch appeared as they crested a low hill, and Clara felt her stomach tighten with familiar dread. It was a modest spread, a sturdy log cabin with a stone chimney, a barn with a corral attached, several horses grazing near a creek lined with cottonwood trees. Good land, well maintained, the kind of place built by hard work rather than inherited wealth. They dismounted in front of the barn, and Daniel took both horses to unsaddle and brush down. Clara stood awkwardly, not sure what was expected of her. In her previous situations, the rules had been made brutally clear within the first hour. Here she had no framework to understand what was happening. "You must be hungry," Daniel said as he led the horses into the barn. "There's food in the cabin. Go ahead and eat whatever you want. I'll be in shortly." Clara walked slowly to the cabin, half expecting a trap. But the door opened easily, and inside she found a single large room that was surprisingly clean and organized. A stone fireplace dominated one wall. A bed stood in the corner, neatly made. A table with two chairs sat near the window, shelves lined with supplies and tools. A small kitchen area with a cast iron stove. It was the home of someone who took care of what they had. But Clara barely noticed the details because her eyes had fixed on the single critical fact. There was only one bed. Her stomach clenched with familiar dread. Of course. Of course there was only one bed. What had she expected? She found bread and cheese and dried meat on the shelves, along with a jar of preserved peaches that made her mouth water despite her fear. She had not eaten since the previous day, and her hands shook as she cut slices of bread and cheese. She was still eating when Daniel came in carrying metal cutters in a small leather pouch. "Let me see that collar," he said, setting the tools on the table. Clara stopped chewing, with her body going rigid. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. She had learned long ago that running only made the punishment worse. Daniel must have seen the fear in her eyes because he held up his hands, palms out, a gesture of peace. "I'm just going to cut it off. That's all. I promise you I'm not going to hurt you." Men always say that. The words were out before Clara could stop them, a whisper of bitter experience. Daniel looked at her for a long moment, and Clara saw something like pain cross his face. "I know," he said quietly, "and I know you have no reason to trust me, but I'm asking you to let me do this one thing. After that, if you want to leave, I'll give you money and a horse, and you can go wherever you want. But I need to get that damn collar off your neck." Clara did not believe him about letting her leave. Why would he spend $100 just to set her free? But she also knew she had no real choice in the matter. Slowly she approached him and tilted her chin up, exposing the collar. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. Daniel positioned the metal cutters carefully, his hands steady and sure. This might pinch a little, but I'll let you be as quick as I can. Hold still. The sound of metal shearing through metal was loud in the quiet cabin. Clara felt pressure against her throat, uncomfortable but not painful. And then suddenly the collar fell away in two pieces, clattering onto the table with a sound like chains breaking. The absence of weight around her neck was so sudden and strange that Clara gasped, her hand flying to her throat to touch bare skin. For 6 months she had worn that collar. For 6 months it had been the first thing she felt when she woke and the last thing she felt before she slept. It had rubbed her skin raw. It had marked her as property. It had been a constant reminder that she had no say in her own life. And now it was gone. There, Daniel said quietly. He picked up the severed collar with an expression of disgust, holding it like it might contaminate him. Wait here, Dema. He walked outside and Clara stood frozen, her fingers exploring the indentation the collar had left on her skin. Through the window she could see Daniel in the fading light using a shovel to dig a hole near the edge of his property. Not a shallow hole. A deep one, the kind you dig when you want to bury something that should never see daylight again. When the hole was deep enough, Daniel dropped the two pieces of collar into it. Then he filled it in, packing the earth down firmly, stomping on it with his boots, like he was making sure whatever evil lived in that iron could never claw its way back to the surface. When he came back inside, his hands were dirty and his expression was grim. That's done. You'll never wear anything like that again. Clara felt tears prick her eyes and she turned away quickly, not wanting him to see. She had taught herself not to cry years ago because tears only made men feel more powerful. But the simple act of destroying that collar, of literally burying it deep in the earth, had cracked something in the armor she wore around her heart. Thank you, she managed to say, her voice barely audible. Daniel washed his hands in a bucket of water by the door. You should finish eating. Then we need to talk about some things. Clara returned to the table, but her appetite had vanished. She watched Daniel warily as he sat down across from her, his large frame making the chair look small. He folded his hands on the table and met her eyes directly. Here's the situation, he said. I bought you today because I could not stand watching you sold to men who are going to use you badly. I know that doesn't make me a hero. I still participated in a system that treats human beings like property, and I'm not proud of that. But what's done is done, and now we need to figure out what comes next. Clara said nothing, waiting for the other boot to drop, waiting for him to tell her what he really expected in return for his $100. You can leave if you want, Daniel continued. I meant what I said. I'll give you money and a horse and supplies, and you can go to California or back east or wherever you think you might have a chance at a decent life. But I'm going to be honest with you. A woman alone on the frontier is vulnerable. You know that better than I do. What's the alternative? Clara asked, her voice flat and careful. You can stay here. I need help running this ranch. It's hard work and I can't pay much. But you would have a roof over your head, food to eat, and I give you my word that I will never touch you in any way you don't want. You would be an employee, not a slave, not property, a person working for wages. Clara studied his face, looking for the lie. Men always lied about their intentions. But Daniel's hazel eyes were steady and clear, and there was something in the set of his jaw that suggested integrity. She wanted desperately to believe him, but belief was a luxury she could not afford. What kind of work? She asked cautiously. Cooking, washing, mending, helping with the animals when needed. General ranch work. It's not easy, but it's honest. And if I stay, where do I sleep? Daniel gestured to the bed in the corner. You take the bed, I'll sleep in the barn. That makes no sense. This is your home. And you're a woman who has been through hell and needs to feel safe. The barn is fine. I've slept in worse places. Clara felt something unfamiliar stir in her chest, something that might have been hope if she had not learned to kill that emotion long ago. How do I know you won't change your mind? How do I know you won't come in here one night and take what you think you paid for? Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a small revolver, which he placed on the table between them. The metal gleamed dull in the lamplight. You keep this under your pillow. If I ever do anything that makes you feel unsafe, you shoot me. I would rather be dead than become the kind of man who forces himself on a woman. Clara stared at the gun. It was a test, obviously. No man would give a woman he had just purchased a loaded weapon unless he was trying to prove something. But what if it was not loaded? What if this was all an elaborate game to make her lower her guard, as though reading her mind? Daniel picked up the revolver, opened the cylinder to show her it was fully loaded with 6 rounds, then set it back down. It's real and it's yours. Protection, not a threat. The sun had fully set now, and the cabin was growing dark. Daniel stood and lit an oil lamp, casting warm light across the rough-hewn walls. You don't have to decide tonight. Get some rest. We can talk more in the morning. He grabbed a blanket from a chest and headed for the door. Bolt this behind me. Don't open it for anyone, including me, unless you feel safe doing so. And then he was gone, leaving Clara alone in the cabin with a loaded gun and more questions than answers. She heard his footsteps crossing to the barn, heard the barn door creak open and shut. Then silence broken only by the sound of crickets and the distant howl of a coyote. Clara picked up the revolver with shaking hands. It was heavier than she expected, cold and solid and real. She checked the cylinder again, confirming it was loaded, then held it in her lap as she sat in the wooden chair staring at the bolted door. She did not trust Daniel Hawthorne. Could not trust him. Not yet. But he had cut off the collar. He had buried it deep. And that single act had given her something she had not felt in 2 years. The faintest possibility that not all men were monsters. She did not sleep in the bed that night. She sat in the chair with the gun in her lap, watching the door, waiting for him to come back and reveal his true intentions. But the door never opened. The night passed slowly, measured out in heartbeats, and held breath. As the first gray light of dawn crept through the window, Clara finally allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Daniel Hawthorne had meant what he said. When full daylight came, Clara heard sounds from the barn. The lowing of cattle, the whinny of horses, the general noise of a ranch coming to life. She stood stiffly, her body aching from sitting in the chair all night, and went to the small mirror hanging on the wall. The face that looked back at her was gaunt and hollow-eyed, marked by hunger and fear and years of abuse. But the indentation around her neck from the collar was already starting to fade. She touched it gently, marveling again at the absence of that hated weight. A knock on the door made her jump, her hand instinctively reaching for the gun. "Miss Morgan," came Daniel's voice through the wood. "I'm going to leave some water by the door for washing. Take your time. I'll be working with the horses if you need anything." Clara waited until she heard his footsteps retreat before unbolting the door. Outside sat a bucket of clean water, still cool from the well, and a bar of soap. She brought them inside quickly and bolted the door again, then stripped off the filthy dress she had been wearing for weeks. She scrubbed away layers of dirt and degradation, wishing she could wash away memories as easily. The soap smelled like lye and lavender, harsh but clean. When she was done, she had to put the same dress back on because she had no other clothes. But at least her skin was clean. She braided her hair to keep it out of her face and tried to make herself presentable. Then she tucked the revolver into the pocket of her dress, feeling its weight against her hip like a promise, and went outside to find Daniel. He was in the corral working with a young horse, patient and gentle, letting the animal come to him rather than forcing compliance. Clara watched from the fence, studying him. He moved with the confidence that comes from knowing exactly what you are doing, but without arrogance. When the horse finally allowed him to touch its neck, he rewarded it with soft words and a piece of apple from his pocket. "You're good with horses," Clara said. Daniel looked up, and his face registered surprise that she had come out. "Horses are honest. Treat them right and they'll give you everything they have. Treat them wrong and they'll never trust you. There's something pure about that. Is that why you treat people the same way?" He smiled slightly, the first smile she had seen from him. It transformed his face, making him look younger and less weathered. "I try. Don't always succeed, but I try." Clara climbed over the fence and approached slowly the way Daniel had approached the horse. "I've decided to stay, for now, but I need some things to be clear." "All right. I do the work you assign and you pay me wages, real wages that I can save. You don't touch me. You don't come into the cabin without knocking. And if you break any of those rules, I leave, or I use this." She patted the pocket where the gun rested. "Agreed." Daniel held out his hand. "Do we have a deal?" Clara looked at his outstretched hand for a long moment. Shaking hands was what partners did, what equals did. She could not remember the last time someone had offered to shake her hand like she was a real person. Slowly, she reached out and clasped his hand. His grip was warm and calloused and firm without being crushing. "Deal," she said. And so Clara Morgan began a new life at the Hawthorne Ranch. The collar that Marcus Ashford had welded around her throat was buried 6 feet deep in Wyoming earth. The gun Daniel Hawthorne had given her rested heavy in her pocket, and for the first time in 2 years, Clara had something she thought was lost forever. A choice: she could leave or she could stay. She could trust or she could protect herself. She could build something new or she could run from the past. The choice was hers. And that choice, more than anything else Daniel had done, was what made her believe that maybe, just maybe, freedom was still possible. Daniel Hawthorne paused in his telling, poured another measure of whiskey into his glass, and looked at his grandson in the gathering dusk. Jonathan sat forward in his chair, completely absorbed, the war he was leaving for tomorrow temporarily forgotten. 6 weeks passed, Daniel said. 6 weeks of Clara working harder than any hired hand I'd ever seen. She woke before dawn to start breakfast, spent her days cooking and washing and mending. I slept in the barn even when the nights grew cold. We didn't touch except for the occasional brush of hands when passing dishes at mealtime, and I always apologize. She kept that gun under her pillow every single night. I respected that. "She didn't trust you?" Jonathan asked. "Trust isn't something you can demand, boy. It has to be earned. And with someone who'd been betrayed as many times as Clara, it takes a long time." Daniel shifted in his chair, the old wood creaking beneath his weight. But then September came, and with it the man who wanted to take back what he thought was his property. The old man's eyes grew distant, seeing not the porch where they sat, but a Wyoming autumn 26 years gone. It was late September when the rhythm of their days began to shift, in ways so subtle Clara almost did not notice at first. Small things. Daniel teaching her to ride better, showing her how to sit a trotting horse without bouncing in the saddle. Sunday afternoons spent setting up tin cans on fence posts, while he taught her to shoot accurately, his hands never touching her as he adjusted her stance with words instead of contact. "Keep both eyes open," Daniel would say, standing 10 feet to her side. "Don't anticipate the recoil. Squeeze the trigger, don't pull it." Clara would fire and the tin can would spin off the post. Each time she hit her target, she felt a small victory, a tiny reclaiming of power. The revolver that had been protection became a tool. She understood a skill she owned. Evening conversations stretched longer, moved deeper, revealed more. They would sit on the porch after supper, watching the sun set behind the mountains, and talk about things that mattered. Books they had read, places they wanted to see, dreams that seemed impossible but beautiful anyway. One night in late August, they had been sitting in comfortable silence when Clara finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the day Daniel bought her. "Why did you do it? Why did you buy me?" Daniel had been quiet for so long. Clara thought he might not answer. The silence stretched out between them, filled only with the sound of crickets and the distant call of an owl hunting in the cottonwoods by the creek. Then he spoke. "I had a sister. Her name was Margaret." And he told her everything. About Margaret, who had been 2 years younger, smart as a whip, beautiful, full of life. About the cholera that took their parents in 1867, when Daniel was 20 and Margaret was 18. About being left with nothing, no money, no family willing to take them in. About trying to find work, trying to keep them fed, and never having enough. Margaret got a job in a saloon. Daniel said, his voice rough with old pain. "I thought it would be fine. I thought I could protect her. I promised her I would protect her, looked her straight in the eye, and gave her my word." The words came harder now. The saloon owner was named Pritchard. He started telling Margaret she owed him money for room and board. All made up, all lies, but she had no way to prove it. Before I understood what was happening, he'd sold her contract to a man heading west to San Francisco. Daniel's hand went unconsciously to his ribs, where old scars still ached. "I found out. I tried to stop it. Got into a fight with 3 of Pritchard's men. They beat me until I couldn't stand, beat me until I couldn't see. I woke up 2 days later and Margaret was gone. I spent 5 years looking for her," he continued. "Went to San Francisco, asked questions in every brothel, every gambling den, every place where women disappeared and nobody cared. Put up handbills with her picture. Hired a detective with the last of my money. Found nothing. Not a single trace. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I think she's dead, and I think she died believing I'd abandoned her when she needed me most, that I'd broken my promise. Clara felt tears sting her eyes. That wasn't your fault. Maybe not, but I couldn't save her. So when I saw you standing in that street wearing a collar like an animal, I saw Margaret. And I knew I couldn't walk away. I had to at least try to save one person, even if I'd been too late to save my sister. They sat in silence for a long time after that, two damaged people watching the stars wheel slowly across the Wyoming sky. Clara felt something shift inside her, a subtle rearrangement of understanding. Daniel Hawthorne was not rescuing her to be a hero. He was trying to atone for a failure that was not his fault, trying to make sense of a world that had stolen someone he loved. I'm sorry about Margaret, Clara finally said. I'm sorry about whatever happened to make you so afraid of trusting people. It wasn't one thing. It was 1,000 things. You don't have to tell me unless you want to. But surprisingly, Clara found that she did want to tell him. So she did, sitting there in the darkness where she could not see his face clearly enough to watch judgment form. She told him about her mother, a prostitute in Sacramento, who had been kind despite the circumstances that trapped her. How her mother had taught her to read, had told her she could be something different. How her mother had died of consumption when Clara was 14, coughing blood into rags until there was nothing left. When she died, I had nothing, Clara said. No money, no family, no protection. A saloon owner named Gordon Pritchard said my mother owed him $200. It was a lie, but I was 14. What could I do? She told him about being sold the first time to a merchant named Robert Keene, who had used her brutally for 6 months before growing tired of her. About the second man, a gambler named Samuel DeWitt, who had won her in a card game and kept her locked in a room for half a year, feeding her just enough to keep her alive. He said my voice was irritating. Clara said, her voice shaking, that women should only speak when spoken to. So I learned to be silent. And then she told him about Marcus Ashford, who had seemed civilized on the surface but had been the cruelest of all. A railroad magnate who had purchased her from a San Francisco gambling den to settle a debt, a man who had enjoyed breaking her spirit as much as using her body. I tried to run after 3 months, Clara said. He caught me before I made it to the street. The next day he had a blacksmith weld that collar around my neck. Told me I was property, nothing more. Said if I tried to kill myself, he'd find any relatives I had left and do the same to them. She touched her throat unconsciously. I wore it for 6 months, every day, every night. It rubbed my skin raw, made me bleed. But worse than the pain was what it meant, that I wasn't human anymore, that I was owned. When she finished, her voice was hoarse and her hands were trembling. But Daniel did not look at her with pity or disgust. He looked at her with respect, as though she had revealed something brave rather than shameful. You survived, he said simply. That takes strength most people don't have. Well, some days I'm not sure survival was worth it. But you're here, you're free of that collar, and tomorrow you can decide what kind of life you want to build. That's worth something, isn't it? Clara thought about that as she went inside to sleep that night. For the first time since she could remember, she lay down in the bed instead of sitting watch in the chair. She kept the revolver under her pillow, but she allowed herself to close her eyes and drift into something approaching genuine sleep. The weeks turned into months, and a rhythm developed between them. They worked together, seamlessly anticipating each other's needs, dividing tasks without needing to discuss them. Clara learned the rhythms of ranch life, the way the seasons dictated the work, the way the land demanded attention and care. Daniel taught her things. How to track deer through the sage by reading signs in the dirt and grass, the broken twigs and disturbed stones that told a story if you knew how to read them. How to preserve food for the coming winter. Canning vegetables in glass jars sealed with wax, smoking meat over low fires of green wood. How to help birth a calf when the cow was struggling. How to recognize when intervention was needed and when nature should be left to work. She taught him that food could be more than fuel. She made bread that was light and golden roasted meat with herbs she gathered from the creek bank, baked dried apple pies that made him close his eyes with pleasure. She turned the cabin into a home, adding small touches that made the space warmer. Curtains for the windows, wildflowers in a jar, the smell of bread baking instead of just the smell of work and sweat. One evening in early October, Clara's back ached from bending over the washtub all day. She had been washing clothes since dawn, her hands raw from the lye soap, her shoulders screaming from the repetitive motion of scrubbing and wringing. She winced when standing up from the dinner table, and Daniel noticed. "You're back." She nodded, trying to hide the pain. "I could help with that if you'd let me," Daniel said carefully. "I know how to work out muscle knots. My sergeant taught me during the war, but only if you're comfortable with it." Every instinct in Clara screamed no. Touch always led to more touch. Boundaries once crossed were never restored. But the pain was real, and Daniel had never broken a promise. "All right, but just my shoulders. Over my dress." Daniel's hands were warm and firm and utterly professional. He found the knots in her shoulders, worked them out with practiced skill, never wandering, never testing boundaries, just providing relief. His touch was healing, not claiming. When he finished, Clara was surprised to find that she felt better, not violated. "Thank you," she said and meant it. It was the first time she had allowed a man to touch her without fear in 7 years. And that night, for the first time, she dreamed of something other than cages and collars. Then came late October, and with it the three riders. Clara was hanging laundry when she saw them approach. Something about their bearing made her instinctively reach for the revolver she now carried in her apron pocket. Three men on horseback, riding with purpose toward the ranch. She walked quickly to where Daniel was repairing fence posts. "We have visitors," she said quietly. "They don't look friendly." Daniel's face grew serious. He straightened, set down his tools, and wiped his hands on his pants. "Go inside and bolt the door. Don't come out unless I call for you." Clara wanted to argue, but the look in his eyes stopped her. She went inside but positioned herself at the window where she could see and hear what was happening. Her hand closed around the revolver, and she made sure it was loaded and ready. The three men dismounted in the yard. They were rough-looking, the kind of drifters who made their living on the wrong side of the law. The one in front had a scarred face and cruel eyes that assessed the ranch like he was evaluating potential loot. The other two flanked him, hands resting near their guns. "You must be Daniel Hawthorne," the scarred man said. "I hear you bought a woman a few months back in Fort Laramie. Woman with dark hair wearing a collar." That right, Clara's blood ran cold. They had come for her. After everything, after the collar was buried, after she had started to believe she might be safe, they had come to drag her back. "I bought a woman's contract, yes," Daniel said carefully. "What business is that of yours?" "Marcus Ashford's nephew thinks you might have taken advantage of his uncle's death to acquire property that should have gone to the family. He wants the woman returned. Says he'll pay you what you spent plus $20 for your trouble. The woman's not for sale." "That's not smart, friend." The scarred man's voice took on an edge. "Vincent Ashford's not a man you want to cross. He's got connections. Judges, marshals, people who matter. You're just a dirt farmer with a few acres and a woman who doesn't belong to you." "I don't care who Vincent Ashford is," Daniel said, his voice steady and cold. "The woman stays here." The scarred man's hand moved toward his gun. "Maybe you didn't hear me right. This isn't a negotiation. We're leaving with the woman one way or another. You can take the money and walk away, or you can make this difficult." Daniel's posture shifted subtly, and Clara recognized the stance of someone ready for violence. His right hand hung loose near his belt, where she knew he kept a revolver tucked into his waistband. "Get off my land, now. I won't ask again. We'll leave when we have what we came for." Everything happened very fast after that. The scarred man drew his gun, but Daniel was faster. His shot caught the man in the shoulder, spinning him around. The other two men went for their weapons, and Clara did not think. She threw open the door and fired twice, her bullets kicking up dirt at the feet of the second man, making him stumble back. The reports from her revolver echoed across the prairie, sharp and final. "The next one goes through your chest," she shouted, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. "Drop your guns and ride out, or I swear I'll kill you." The two uninjured men looked at each other, then at their wounded companion clutching his bleeding shoulder, then at Clara standing in the doorway with a smoking revolver held in both hands aimed directly at them. Whatever they had expected, it was not this. Not a woman who would fight back. Not someone who looked ready and willing to pull the trigger. They dropped their guns, hauled the wounded man onto his horse, and rode away at a gallop, disappearing into the gathering dusk in a cloud of dust. Clara stood frozen, the revolver shaking in her hands, now that the immediate danger had passed. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Her breath came in short gasps. She had shot at men. She had threatened to kill them. And she had meant every word. Daniel walked over and gently took the gun from her, setting the safety before handing it back. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I think so. Are you, though?" "Yes. Thank you for not staying inside like I asked." "I couldn't let them take me." Her voice broke slightly. "And I couldn't let them hurt you." Daniel looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. Respect, certainly. Gratitude. But something else, too, something deeper that he was not ready to name and she was not ready to hear. "We should prepare in case they come back with more men," he said. "Vincent Ashford has money and influence. This isn't over." But the men did not come back that night, or the next day, or the day after that. Daniel and Clara maintained vigilance anyway. They boarded windows-loaded rifles, planned escape routes. They worked together in charged silence, and Clara realized something that both terrified and exhilarated her. She was not just protecting herself anymore. She was protecting this place, this life, this man who had given her freedom. And the thought of losing it, of losing him, made her chest ache in ways that had nothing to do with fear. By the fourth night, exhaustion was setting in. Daniel suggested he sleep in the cabin on the floor so he could respond faster if they were attacked. Clara agreed, and for the first time since that first night, he slept under the same roof. On the seventh day, when no further threat had materialized, Daniel made a decision. "I should ride into Fort Laramie, find out what Vincent's planning, see if there's legal recourse we can take." Clara felt fear grip her chest like a vice. "What if it's a trap? What if they're waiting for you? Then I need to know. We can't live like this forever, looking over our shoulders, waiting for them to come back." He had a point, but Clara could not shake the dread that settled over her like a shroud. "Let me come with you." "No, if something happens, I need to know you're safe here. You've got the rifles, you know how to use them. If I'm not back by tomorrow night, you ride to the Johnsons' ranch 10 miles west. They're good people. They'll help you." He rode out before dawn, and Clara spent the longest day of her life alone at the ranch, jumping at every sound, watching the horizon for any sign of riders. She cleaned the rifles 3 times. She paced the cabin until she wore a path in the floor. She realized with sudden crystalline clarity that if something happened to Daniel, she was not just losing protection. She was losing someone she cared about, someone who mattered more than anyone had mattered in longer than she could remember. For the first time, Clara admitted to herself what she had been refusing to acknowledge for weeks. She loved him. God help her, she loved Daniel Hawthorne. Not because he had saved her, not because she owed him anything, but because of who he was, because of his patience and his kindness and his unwavering respect, because he had given her choice when the world had taken it away, because he had buried that collar deep and never once made her regret staying. He returned at sunset, his face grim, but not worried. Clara met him in the yard, her heart-pounding relief flooding through her so strongly her knees nearly buckled. "It's over," Daniel said. "Vincent Ashford's been arrested." He explained everything as they walked to the cabin. Marcus Ashford's estate had been mired in debt and legal troubles that went back years. Vincent had been trying to liquidate assets, including humans he considered property, to pay off creditors and keep himself out of debtor's prison. But a federal marshal had been investigating Vincent for fraud and embezzlement. The attempt to reclaim Clara, combined with testimony from the 3 men who had fled the ranch, had given the marshal the evidence he needed to make an arrest. Vincent Ashford was in jail facing charges that would likely send him to prison for a decade or more. "You're free," Daniel told her, taking her hands in his, "legally and completely. Vincent's claim on you never had any validity in the first place. What Marcus did was kidnapping and false imprisonment. The law just didn't care enough to prosecute until money was involved." Clara sat down heavily on the porch steps, feeling like the ground had shifted under her feet. "So I could leave right now and no one could stop me." "That's right." Daniel sat down beside her, close but not touching. "You could go anywhere, be anyone. The world's open to you in a way it hasn't been since you were 14 years old." She looked around at the ranch, at the cabin and the barn and the monument stretching out under the enormous sky, at the life she had built here over the past 4 months. This simple cabin, this hard work, this quiet companionship with a man who had proven himself worthy of trust. All of it had value she could not have imagined when she stood in Fort Laramie Street wearing a collar. "What if I don't want to leave?" she asked quietly. Hope flared in Daniel's eyes, almost painful to see. "Then you could stay. Not as an employee anymore, as a partner, as someone building this ranch alongside me, as someone who chooses to be here because she wants to, not because she has no other option. Daniel, I don't know if I can be what you need. I'm broken in ways I don't think I can fix. He turned to face her fully, and his expression was so open, so honest, it made her chest ache. You're not broken. You're scarred. But scars are proof of survival, proof of strength. And I'm not asking you to be anything other than who you are. I'm not asking you to be ready for things you're not ready for. I'm just asking if you would consider staying, building something here, seeing where this goes between us. Clara looked into his hazel eyes and saw no pressure, no expectation of reciprocation, just honest affection and infinite patience. Just a man offering partnership, not ownership. She thought about the collar buried deep in Wyoming earth. She thought about the gun under her pillow that she had not needed to use against him. She thought about the way he said her name like it was something valuable. She thought about the ache in her chest when he had ridden away that morning, the fear that she might never see him again. I'd like to stay, she said, but slowly. I need to do this slowly. As slow as you need, Daniel promised, and there was such relief in his voice it made her want to cry my down. I've waited this long. I can wait longer. I'll wait as long as it takes. Winter came to Wyoming with a vengeance that year. Snow piled deep and temperatures plunged below zero. The wind howled across the prairie like something alive and angry, looking for any crack to slip through, any weakness to exploit. Daniel and Clara worked together to keep the ranch running, feeding animals twice a day, hauling hay through snow that came up to their knees, breaking ice on water troughs with axes, their breaths steaming in air so cold it hurt to breathe, keeping the cabin warm, feeding the fire constantly, banking it carefully at night so they would not wake to frozen pipes. The routine became domestic and comfortable. They fell into patterns, learned each other's rhythms. Clara would wake first, start the coffee, begin breakfast while Daniel fed the animals. They would work through the day, breaking only for the midday meal, and in the evenings they would sit by the fire reading or talking or just existing in comfortable silence. Slowly, incrementally, Clara allowed herself to get closer to him. She let him hold her hand sometimes in the evenings, their fingers intertwined, and as they watched the fire burn low. She leaned against him when they sat watching the flames dance, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. She allowed herself to enjoy the sound of his laughter and the warmth of his smile. And Daniel never pushed, never assumed, never tested the boundaries she had set. He waited with the patience of a man who understood that healing could not be rushed, that trust was built in small moments rather than grand gestures. One night in January, a storm blew in so fierce that even the barn became uninhabitable. The temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the windows, intricate patterns of frost that would have been beautiful if they had not been so dangerous. Wind screamed through gaps in the barn walls, and snow drifted through openings that had seemed insignificant in summer. Daniel came to the cabin door shivering despite the heavy coat he wore. "Can't stay in the barn tonight," he said. "Temperatures below zero and dropping. I'll freeze before morning." "You can't sleep in the barn tonight," Clara said, making the decision quickly. "You'll freeze to death." "I'll be fine. I've got blankets. I'll bank the fire." "You'll be dead by morning. Come inside." Daniel hesitated, and Clara could see the conflict on his face. They had maintained such careful boundaries for months. "Clara, we talked about this. Your space, your safety. We could share," Clara said carefully, the words coming out before she could second-guess them. "The bed, I mean? Just sleep. Nothing else. You could stay on top of the covers if that makes you feel better. But it's cold, and there's no sense in either of us being uncomfortable when that bed's big enough for two people to sleep respectably." She saw surprise flash across his face, followed by something that might have been hope. "Are you sure?" It was a risk. Everything in Clara screamed that this was how it started, how the boundaries came down, how the bad things happened. But she was tired of being afraid. She was tired of letting her past dictate her future. And more than anything, she trusted Daniel Hawthorne in a way she had never trusted anyone. "I'm sure," she said. "Come inside before you freeze." They lay in the bed that night, a careful space between them, both fully clothed. Clara wore her nightgown with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Daniel stayed on top of the quilt, fully dressed, except for his boots. Clara was so tense she thought she might shatter every muscle, rigid, her hand inches from the revolver under her pillow. But Daniel did exactly what he had promised. He lay still, his breathing slow and even, making no move toward her. He did not reach out, did not test boundaries, did not do any of the things Clara had learned to expect from men. Gradually, as the hours passed and nothing bad happened, Clara felt herself relax. The tension drained from her shoulders. Her breathing slowed to match his. She moved closer just slightly and felt the warmth radiating from him, even through the quilt that separated them. She allowed her hand to rest near his, their fingers almost touching. "Is this all right?" she whispered. "This is perfect," Daniel whispered back, and she could hear the smile in his voice. And it was. Perfect in a way Clara had never experienced. This quiet intimacy without pressure. This sharing of space without demands. This trust without violation. She fell asleep that way, close enough to touch, but not touching warm enough to rest, safe enough to dream of something other than cages. After that night, they shared the bed regularly when the cold was fierce. Clara found herself healing in ways she had not thought possible. Touch became something she could enjoy rather than endure. Closeness became something she could want rather than fear. Slowly, tentatively, she began to imagine a future where intimacy was not just bearable but desired. And through it all, Daniel remained patient. He never pushed, never assumed, never demanded reciprocation. He simply existed beside her, steady and sure, waiting for her to come to him in her own time. Spring came to Wyoming with an explosion of wildflowers and new grass. The snow melted, turning the creek into a rushing torrent. Ices broke up with sounds like gunshots. The world turned green again, and with the warmth came a loosening, a thawing of more than just the frozen earth. Clara planted a larger garden, working the soil with her hands, feeling connected to the earth in a way she never had before. She chose seeds, carefully planning meals months in advance. Tomatoes and beans and squash. Herbs for cooking and healing. Flowers because beauty mattered too. Daniel bought more cattle, expanding the herd, talking about his plans for the future, as though Clara would automatically be part of them. And she realized that she wanted to be. That somewhere in the past 9 months, this ranch had become home in a way no place had ever been before. One evening in May, as they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Clara turned to Daniel. Her heart hammered in her chest. Her palms were sweaty, but she knew what she wanted to say, and she knew she meant it. "I think I'm ready." Daniel looked at her, patient as always. "Ready for what?" "Ready to be with you, really be with you." The words came out in a rush. "Not because I have to, not because I owe you anything, but because I want to, because I love you." The words hung in the air between them, precious and fragile. Daniel looked at her with wonder, as though she had given him something more valuable than gold. His eyes shone with emotion he did not try to hide. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice rough. "There's no rush, Clara. I can wait as long as you need. Forever, if that's what it takes." "I'm sure, Sam." She took his hand, squeezed it. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you, Daniel Hawthorne. I choose you. Not because you saved me, but because of who you are. Because you gave me choice when everyone else tried to take it away." Daniel stood and held out his hand. Clara took it. They walked inside the cabin together, and for the first time in her life, Clara experienced intimacy as something beautiful. Daniel was patient and gentle, constantly checking to make sure she was comfortable, letting her set the pace and the boundaries. When old fears rose up, he stopped and held her until they passed. When she needed to cry, he let her, understanding that the tears were not about him, but about everything she had survived to reach this moment. And when she cried afterward, he held her and understood that they were tears of release, of grief for everything she had lost and joy for what she had found, of mourning for the girl she had been and celebration for the woman she had become. "I love you too," he said into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "I've loved you since the day I saw you standing in that street, refusing to let them break your spirit. I will love you for the rest of my life." Daniel paused in his telling, looking at Jonathan in the gathering darkness. The young man sat transfixed, his whiskey still untouched, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's when your grandmother became Clara Hawthorne," Daniel said quietly. "Not because the law said so, not because I bought her, but because she chose. And that choice, that beautiful, terrifying, redemptive choice, was hers alone to make." "What about the wedding?" Jonathan asked. Daniel smiled, the wrinkles around his eyes deepening. June of 1873. But the real wedding had already happened the night she said, "I love you," and meant it. The papers were just confirmation of what already existed. He poured another measure of whiskey, his hand steady despite his age. "Now let me tell you the rest. About our children. About how we built this house right over the spot where that collar is buried. And about the 25 years we built together, one day at a time, one choice at a time." They were married in Fort Laramie on a bright day in June of 1873, with a few local friends as witnesses. Clara wore a simple blue dress she had sewn herself, working by lamplight for 2 weeks to get every stitch perfect. The fabric was calico printed with tiny flowers, nothing fancy but clean and new in hers. Daniel wore his best suit, still worn and patched at the elbows where the fabric had given way, but clean and pressed with care. She had taken the iron to herself. The ceremony was brief, conducted by a circuit judge who happened to be passing through the territory. Judge Morrison was a kindly man with white whiskers and eyes that had seen enough of the world to recognize something worth celebrating when he saw it. "Do you, Daniel Hawthorne, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." Daniel's voice was steady and sure. "And do you, Clara Morgan, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Clara looked at Daniel, at the man who had cut off her collar and buried it deep, who had given her a gun and slept in the barn, who had waited with infinite patience while she learned to trust again. "I do." The celebration was modest, just cake and coffee in the back room of the general store. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the mercantile, had baked the cake 2 layers with white frosting and wild strawberries from her garden. There were maybe 15 people there, ranch hands and neighbors, who had watched Daniel and Clara build something real over the past year. But when Clara cut the cake with Daniel's hand over hers on the knife, when she looked up and saw the way he was looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world, she felt richer than any railroad baron's wife. Because she had chosen this, every moment of it, and that made all the difference. Their life together was not easy, young. The ranch demanded constant work from first light to well past dark during the busy seasons. There were hard years when cattle prices dropped and they had to sell at a loss just to pay for supplies. Years when the weather turned cruel and they lost animals to cold or disease or predators. But they faced everything together, partners in the truest sense. Clara discovered she had a talent for managing the ranch's finances that surprised them both. She kept meticulous records in a leather-bound ledger, tracking every cent that came in and went out. She could look at the numbers and see patterns, make predictions about when to buy and when to sell that proved uncannily accurate. Daniel discovered that having someone to share the burden made even the hardest work bearable. That coming home to a warm cabin and a hot meal, and someone who genuinely cared whether he lived or died, changed the nature of existence itself. The first year of their marriage tested them in ways neither had anticipated. They were still learning each other, still navigating the delicate balance between Clara's need for independence and Daniel's desire to protect. There were moments of friction, times when old fears would rise up in Clara, and she would pull away, build walls that took days to come down. Times when Daniel's patience would wear thin, and he would have to walk out to the barn to cool his temper, to remind himself that healing was not linear, that trust once broken took years to rebuild. But they always came back to each other, always talked through the hard things instead of letting resentment fester, always chose partnership over pride, understanding over anger. In the spring of 1875, Clara realized she was pregnant. She knew before she missed her monthly courses, knew from the way food smelled different and the world seemed brighter and more dangerous at the same time. She told Daniel one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, "I'm carrying," she said simply. Daniel went very still beside her. Then he turned and took both her hands in his, and she saw tears in his eyes. "A baby, a baby. Are you happy about it?" The question surprised her until she realized that of course he would ask. Of course he would want to know if this was something she wanted or something that frightened her. "I'm terrified," she admitted, "but yes, I'm happy." The pregnancy brought back memories Clara had tried to bury, moments of violation and powerlessness that made her wake gasping in the night, her hands instinctively going to her belly as if to protect the life growing there from ghosts of the past. She had nightmares about Ashford, about being collared again, about giving birth in a cage while men watched and laughed. But Daniel was there through all of it. He held her when the nightmares came, his arms solid and real, his voice low and soothing as he reminded her where she was, that she was safe, that no one would ever hurt her or their child. He read to her in the evenings, his deep voice making even mundane passages from agricultural journals sound like poetry. He built a cradle from cottonwood that grew by the creek, sanding it smooth for hours, so there would be no splinters to harm delicate skin, carving simple flowers into the headboard, because he wanted their child to see beauty from the first moment. Their son was born in December of 1875, on a night when snow fell soft and silent outside the cabin windows. The labor was long, 16 hours of pain that made Clara scream and curse and beg for it to end. Mrs. Henderson came to help the midwife from town, a woman who had brought half the babies in the territory into the world and knew her business. When it was finally over, when the baby emerged red and squalling and perfect, Miss Henderson cleaned him and wrapped him and placed him in Clara's arms. And Clara looked down at her son and understood viscerally what it meant to want to protect someone, to give everything you had to ensure their safety and happiness. The love she felt was so fierce, it was almost painful, like her heart had grown too large for her chest. They named him James after Daniel's father. He had Daniel's hazel eyes and Clara's dark hair, and when he nursed, he made small, contented sounds that made them both laugh through their tears. Daniel was a devoted father from the first moment. He took turns walking James when he cried at night, pacing the cabin floor with the baby against his shoulder, humming tuneless songs that somehow soothed. He changed diapers without complaint, talking to the baby in a soft voice that made Clara's heart ache with love. He would hold James and just stare at him with an expression of such wonder, it made Clara fall in love with her husband all over again. Watching Daniel with their son, Clara marveled at how different he was from every man she had known before. His strength was in his gentleness, his power in his restraint. He taught their son, through example, what it meant to be a good man, and that lesson started from the moment James drew his first breath. But the first summer with baby James brought a crisis that nearly broke them. Drought came to Wyoming in 1876, the worst anyone could remember in 20 years. It started in June when the usual spring rains never came. By July, the creek that ran through their property had dwindled from a rushing stream to a weak trickle. The grass turned brown and brittle, crunching underfoot like old bones. Cattle began losing weight, ribs showing through their hides, their eyes going dull with thirst and hunger. Other ranchers in the area were selling at a loss or abandoning their land entirely, loading wagons and heading east or west anywhere, but this place where the earth had turned hard and cruel. Daniel and Clara watched their neighbors go, watched the life drain from the land like blood from a wound, and knew they were running out of time. One night in late July, Daniel sat at the table with his head in his hands, the account book spread before him. Clara was nursing James, rocking gently in the chair Daniel had made, watching her husband's shoulders slump with defeat. "We might lose everything," Daniel said, his voice hollow with despair. "I've got maybe $40 left. Not enough to buy feed for the cattle, not enough to last through winter, even if we don't eat. I don't know if we can hold on another month." Clara looked at those books, at the careful columns of numbers that told the story of their struggle. She thought about the collar buried deep in the ground beneath where they sat, about how far she had come from that day in Fort Laramie. She had not survived everything she had survived just to give up now. She remembered something her mother had told her long ago in one of the rare moments of lucidity before the consumption took her. Stories from the gold rush days in Sacramento, when water was worth more than gold, when men killed over access to streams. "Let me see the land deed," Clara said. Daniel pulled it from the strongbox, handed it over. Clara read it carefully, the legal description, with all its arcane language about meets and bounds, sections and townships. She had learned to read contracts over the years, learned to spot the fine print that men used to trap women like her. And there, buried in the middle of the second page, she found it. "Daniel," she said slowly, "we have rights to water from the spring that feeds our creek. It says here our claim extends 2 miles upstream. What good does that do us? The creek's nearly dry. But the spring isn't. I've seen other ranchers watering their cattle from it. They're using our water." Daniel sat up straighter, hope kindling in his eyes for the first time in weeks. "You're sure? Look." She brought the deed to him, pointed at the relevant passage. "Right there. We have exclusive rights to that spring. We just never filed the proper claim." The next morning, Clara bundled James into a sling against her chest and rode to Fort Laramie. It was a hard ride 15 miles with a 3-month-old baby, but she made it before noon. She went straight to the territorial land office, a dusty room in the back of the courthouse where a bored clerk sat reading a newspaper. "I need to file a water rights claim," Clara said, placing the deed on the counter. The clerk barely looked up. "Cost you $10. $10 was a quarter of what they had left. But Clara counted out the coins without hesitation, watched the clerk process the paperwork with agonizing slowness, and left with a stamped and certified copy that made their claim official and enforceable by law. When she returned and told Daniel what she had done, he looked at her with a mixture of awe and gratitude that made her cheeks flush. "You saved us," he said. "Not me, you." "We're partners," Clara replied, bouncing James gently as the baby fussed. "We save each other. That's how this works." Within a week, Daniel had confronted the ranchers who had been using their spring. There was some grumbling, some threats, but the law was clear. The spring was Hawthorne property. The other ranchers would have to find water elsewhere or buy it from Daniel at a fair price. The drought broke in late August, rain finally falling in sheets that turned the dust to mud and made the grass spring back to life almost overnight. Their cattle survived when many others did not. The ranch began to prosper in ways it never had before, built on Clara's quick thinking as much as Daniel's hard work. 2 years later, in November of 1877, their daughter arrived. This birth was harder than the first. Clara labored for 18 hours, and there were moments when the midwife's face grew grim when Daniel had to leave the cabin because he could not bear to watch Clara in such pain. There were moments when Clara thought she might die, when the agony was so intense she almost welcomed death as release. Mrs. Henderson worked tirelessly, her hands skilled and sure, talking Clara through each contraction, each push. And finally, after a night and most of a day, Catherine emerged into the world, tiny and fierce, with Clara's blue eyes and stubborn chin. When it was finally over and Catherine was safely delivered, Daniel held Clara's hand and wept openly. "I almost lost you," he said, his voice breaking. "God, Clara, I can't lose you. I can't." "You won't," Clara promised, though she was exhausted and pale, her body feeling like it had been torn apart and barely stitched back together. "I'm not going anywhere. We have too much left to build." The recovery took months. Clara was weak, unable to do the heavy work she was accustomed to. For the first time, Daniel had to hire help, a woman from town named Sarah, who came 3 times a week to help with the household chores and mind the children while Clara rested. It was a hard lesson for Clara, learning to let others help, learning that accepting assistance was not the same as being owned or controlled. Learning that she could be vulnerable without being powerless, that needing help did not make her weak. But she healed. And when she was strong again, the bond between her and Daniel had deepened in ways that went beyond words. They had faced the possibility of death together and chosen life, had stared into the abyss and refused to fall. James was 2.5 when Catherine was born, old enough to be fascinated by his baby sister, bringing her toys and patting her head with enthusiastic toddler affection. He would sit by her cradle and tell her stories in his baby babble, seriously explaining the world as he understood it. The Hawthorne Ranch grew over the years, becoming more prosperous as Daniel and Clara's hard work paid off. They hired hands to help with the cattle, young men looking for honest work and fair treatment. Daniel and Clara never forgot what it felt like to struggle, never forgot that people's labor had value and dignity. They paid fair wages and treated their workers with respect, and in return, they earned loyalty and dedication that money alone could never buy. In 1880, when Clara was 29 and Daniel was 34, they finally had the money to build a larger house. A proper 2-story structure with bedrooms for the children and a kitchen that was not cramped and dark, where Clara could work without bumping into the table every time she turned around. The cabin that Daniel had built with his own hands 9 years earlier would be converted into a bunkhouse for the ranch hands. But before the builders started work on the new house, Daniel took Clara out to a specific spot on their land, to the place where 8 years earlier he had buried her collar 6 feet deep. "I want to build the new house right here," he said, his voice steady and sure. "Right over the place where we buried the worst part of your past. So every day when you walk through your home, you're literally standing on ground that represents your freedom and your choice." Clara looked at him with tears in her eyes. After 8 years of marriage, he could still surprise her with gestures that showed how deeply he understood her, how much thought he put into making sure she knew she mattered. "That's perfect," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Let's build our future exactly there." The house went up over the summer of 1880, a beautiful structure with glass windows that let in light and a wide porch perfect for watching Wyoming's dramatic sunsets. It had 4 bedrooms upstairs, a parlor and dining room downstairs, and a kitchen with a cast iron stove that had been shipped all the way from Chicago. The children ran through the rooms as they were being built, their laughter echoing off the fresh pine walls. James, now 5, pretended he was helping the carpenters carrying small pieces of wood with great seriousness, asking questions about how everything worked. Catherine, almost 3, collected wood shavings in her apron pockets like they were treasure-making little piles that she would show to anyone who would look. Clara stood watching the construction one afternoon in August, her hand resting on her growing belly. She was pregnant again, due in early spring. She thought about the girl who had stood in Fort Laramie Street wearing a collar, believing she had no future worth living. That girl could never have imagined this life, this joy, this profound sense of belonging. That girl had been Clara, and Clara was her. But she was also so much more, now shaped by love and choice and the slow, patient work of healing. Their third child was born in March of 1881, a sturdy boy they named William after Daniel's grandfather. He inherited his mother's fierce independence and his father's patient temperament, a combination that would serve him well in the years to come. The family felt complete. 3 children who would grow up knowing they were loved and wanted, who would never experience the helplessness and degradation their mother had endured. As the years passed, Clara became a respected figure in Fort Laramie and the surrounding ranches. She helped other women when she could, offering work to those who needed it, standing up against men who thought money gave them ownership. In 1883, a young woman arrived in Fort Laramie in circumstances eerily similar to Clara's past. Her name was Elizabeth. She was 19 and she had been sold to pay her father's gambling debts. She had the same hollow look in her eyes that Clara remembered seeing in her own reflection years before, that look of someone who had gone somewhere deep inside where no one could reach her. Clara offered her a job at the ranch immediately, a safe place to live, fair wages, and most importantly, a choice. Elizabeth was suspicious at first, waiting for the trap to spring. But day by day, week by week, she watched how Daniel and Clara treated each other, how they treated their children, how they treated the ranch hands. She watched and slowly began to believe that maybe the world held more than cruelty. Clara taught her ranch work, but more than that, she taught her that she had value beyond what men said she was worth, that her past did not have to dictate her future, that healing was possible, though it would not be easy or quick. "I know what you're thinking," Clara told her one day as they worked together in the garden. "I know because I thought the same things, that you don't deserve kindness, that any moment now the other shoe will drop, that men who seem good are just better at hiding what they really want." Elizabeth looked at her with wide eyes. "How did you know?" "Because I wore a collar once, too." Clara touched her throat where the indentation had long since faded. "Not a real one, but close enough. And a man cut it off and buried it deep and gave me a choice. And I chose to stay. To build something new. To believe that not all men are monsters." "Does it get easier?" Elizabeth asked. "The fear. Yes, slowly, with time and patience and people who prove themselves worthy of trust. You'll get there." Elizabeth stayed for 2 years, learning and slowly rebuilding her sense of self. Eventually, she moved on to Denver, where she found work as a seamstress and built a life on her own terms. She wrote to Clara once a year, letters filled with gratitude and updates on her progress. She married eventually a kind man who worked as a school teacher, had children, built a life that was hers by choice. Clara kept those letters in a wooden box, reading them sometimes when she needed to remember how far she had come, how much difference one person's kindness could make. The children grew, each developing their own distinct personality and path. James was serious and thoughtful, fascinated by law and justice. When he was 10, he watched a trial in Fort Laramie, a claimed dispute between 2 ranchers, and came home full of questions about right and wrong, fairness and mercy. "How do they decide who's telling the truth?" he asked his parents over dinner. "They listen to the evidence," Daniel explained. "They look at what can be proven, not just what people say." "But what if both people seem honest? What if they both believe they're right?" Clara smiled at her son. "Then the judge has to make the best decision he can with the information he has. That's why being a judge or a lawyer is so important, because you're helping people find justice when they can't find it themselves." James absorbed this thinking deeply. Clara saw her own pain transformed into her son's drive for justice, and she encouraged it. A world where people like James fought for those who could not fight for themselves was a world worth building. Catherine was bright and curious, always asking questions about how things worked. When she was 11, Daniel was treating a horse that had torn its leg on barbed wire, and Catherine insisted on helping. She watched fascinated as he cleaned the wound, applied a poultice made from herbs Clara had gathered, bandaged it carefully. "How did you know what to do?" she asked. "Learned it from the army surgeon during the war," Daniel said. "Medicine's the same whether you're treating a man or a horse. Clean the wound, stop infection, give the body what it needs to heal itself." From that moment, Catherine was fascinated by medicine. She read every medical book she could find, borrowed texts from the doctor in Fort Laramie, studied anatomy from veterinary manuals. She talked about becoming a doctor, an unusual ambition for a girl in the 1890s, but her parents supported her without reservation. "The world's changing," Clara told her daughter. "Women are going to medical school now. If that's what you want, we'll find a way to make it happen." William was the ranch hand of the family, happiest when he was working with the horses and cattle. He had Daniel's way with animals, that patient gentleness that earned trust rather than demanding obedience. From the time he could walk, he followed his father around, imitating everything Daniel did. By the time William was 10, he could rope a calf, break a young horse to saddle, and doctor sick cattle, as well as any grown ranch hand. It was clear he would stay on the ranch, would carry on what his parents had built. In the summer of 1890, James left for law school back east. He was 15, having studied hard and tested well enough to be accepted early. He was tall and serious, determined to become a lawyer who fought for people who could not fight for themselves. Clara cried as she watched him board the train, but they were proud tears. Her son would do good work in the world. He had been raised by parents who understood the importance of justice and compassion, who had shown him through their own lives that it was possible to build something good from broken pieces. Daniel held her as the train disappeared into the distance. "We did well with him." "We did well with all of them," Clara replied, watching the horizon long after the train was gone. 4 years later, in 1894, Catherine left for a women's college in Denver to study medicine. The neighbors in Fort Laramie were skeptical, whispering behind their hands about women who got ideas above their station. "Woman doctor," old Mr. Peterson said, shaking his head. "What's the world coming to? Next thing you know, they'll want to vote." Daniel's response was firm and clear. "It's coming to a place where my daughter can be anything she wants to be, where women are judged by their abilities, not their gender. That's what it's coming to, and I'll thank you to keep your outdated opinions to yourself." William stayed on the ranch, taking over more of the daily operations as Daniel's joints began to ache from decades of hard physical labor. The old war wound in his leg bothered him more with each passing year, especially in cold weather. He moved slower, tired more easily, but he was only 53 and too stubborn to think of himself as old. At 22, William married a sensible young woman named Margaret, who loved ranching life as much as he did. She was the daughter of a neighboring rancher, a woman who could rope and ride and work cattle as well as any man. She took to the work naturally, and Clara taught her everything she knew about managing a household and a business. Clara and Daniel became grandparents in 1896 when William and Margaret had a daughter named Rose. Holding her first grandchild, Clara marveled at the impossible distance she had traveled from that terrible day in Fort Laramie 24 years earlier. The baby in her arms was free, loved, wanted, protected. She would grow up never knowing what it meant to be property, never experiencing the fear that had defined Clara's youth. She would have choices her grandmother never had. That was legacy. That was victory. By 1897, the family had grown even more. James came home married to a fellow lawyer named Sarah, bringing twin boys named Thomas and Henry, who were 2 years old and full of mischief. Catherine came home married to a doctor named Robert, with a 1-year-old daughter named Grace, who had just started walking. William and Margaret welcomed a second child, a son they named Daniel after his grandfather. The Hawthorne Ranch rang with the noise and laughter of 3 generations. 5 grandchildren running through the house that was built over buried chains, their joy echoing off the walls, their futures stretching out before them, unlimited and bright. They celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary in June of 1898, with all 3 children home along with their spouses and growing families. The house was full to bursting, children everywhere running and playing and getting into everything, the kind of beautiful chaos that comes from love and life lived fully. Clara spent days preparing for the celebration. She made her special bread, 3 kinds of power roast that had been cooking slow all day. Margaret helped, and Sarah and even Catherine pitched in when she could wrangle her daughter long enough. The men roasted a steer over an open pit in the yard, tending it carefully, drinking whiskey and telling stories. The neighbors came bringing food and music and good wishes. There was dancing on the porch as the sun set, fiddles playing into the night, children running wild in the summer twilight. Daniel and Clara danced together for the first time in years, moving slowly, his hand on her waist, her head on his shoulder, both of them gray now, but still together, still choosing each other day after day. That night, after everyone had gone to bed and the house was finally quiet, Daniel and Clara sat on the porch. They had sat on countless times before. She leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders, looking out at the land they had built together. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, the same stars that had witnessed everything. The collar buried beneath their feet, the hard years and the good ones, the children growing, the legacy taking root. "Do you remember the day you cut off that collar?" Clara asked. "Every detail," Daniel said. "I remember thinking you were the bravest person I'd ever seen, standing there terrified but refusing to break. I remember thinking you were probably lying, that you'd turn out to be just like the others. What made you decide to trust me?" Clara was quiet for a moment, thinking back across the years. "You buried the collar deep. You didn't just throw it away or toss it aside. You buried it like it was something evil that needed to be put down permanently. That's when I started to believe you might actually be different." Daniel pulled her closer, and she fit against him perfectly after 25 years of practice. "Best $100 I ever spent. I was never worth $100. You were worth everything I had. You still are." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge one by one across the vast Wyoming sky. Clara thought about the girl she had been and the woman she had become. The journey between those two versions of herself had been long and painful, but it had also been worth it. She had survived. She had healed. She had loved and been loved in return. She had built a family and a legacy that would outlast her. The collar that Marcus Ashford had welded around her neck was still buried somewhere beneath the foundation of their house, buried deep in Wyoming earth, where it could never hurt anyone again. And every day Clara walked over that spot, stood over that symbol of her past bondage, and lived a life defined not by what had been done to her, but by what she had chosen to become. She had been owned, but she had become free. She had been broken, but she had healed. She had been alone, but she had found partnership. And through it all, Daniel Hawthorne had stood beside her, not as her savior, but as her partner, not as her owner, but as her equal, not demanding her love, but earning it day by day, year by year, through patience and kindness and unwavering respect. "I love you," Clara said the words as true in 1898 as they had been in 1873 when she first spoke them. "I love you too," Daniel replied, "for the rest of my life and whatever comes after." And there on the porch of the house built over buried chains, surrounded by the family they had created and the life they had chosen, Clara Morgan Hawthorne was finally completely, irrevocably free. Daniel finished his story and looked at his grandson in the darkness. Jonathan sat silent, processing everything he had heard. The old man's voice was hoarse from talking, and he took a long drink of whiskey, letting it burn down his throat. "That's the story, boy," Daniel said quietly. "That's how I met your grandmother. That's what I learned about being a man." "What happened to the collar?" Jonathan asked. "Is it really under the house?" Daniel nodded. 6 feet down, right under where we're sitting. Been there 26 years. Will be there long after I'm gone. Your children's children will walk over it and never know it's there. But it is. A reminder of what we overcome, what we choose to leave buried." And Grandma Clara, where is she tonight? "Inside, getting ready for bed. We're old now, Jonathan. I'm 69, she's 64. But she's still the same woman who stood in that Fort Laramie Street and refused to be broken. Still the bravest person I've ever known." Jonathan was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "What does this have to do with me going to war?" Daniel leaned forward, his hazel eyes intense in the lamplight. "Everything, boy. You're going off to fight thinking that's what makes you a man. Thinking courage is about killing the enemy, about being willing to die for your country. And maybe there's truth in that. I fought in the war. I know what that kind of courage looks like." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But I want you to understand that there's another kind of courage. The courage to cut someone free when the whole world says they're property. The courage to wait patiently while someone heals. The courage to give someone choice and respect that choice even when it costs you. The courage to build something good in a world that's full of evil. That's the courage that lasts, Jonathan. That's the courage that builds legacies. Your grandmother didn't need a hero, Daniel continued. She needed a partner. She needed someone who would give her a choice, who would respect that choice, who would stand beside her while she found her own strength. That's what a real man does. He doesn't rescue, he empowers. He doesn't own, he partners. Jonathan nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his young eyes. When you go to war tomorrow, Daniel said, you fight with honor. You do your duty. But when you come home, assuming God grants you that mercy, remember this story. Remember that the greatest thing you can do as a man is not to conquer, but to liberate. Not to possess, but to partner. Not to take, but to give freely and ask nothing in return except the choice to stay or go. The old man stood, his joints creaking, and put a hand on his grandson's shoulder. Now go inside and get some sleep. You have a long journey tomorrow. And Jonathan, come home safe. This family has lost enough people we loved. Jonathan stood and embraced his grandfather, holding on longer than usual. I'll remember, Grandpa, about the collar, about choosing to free instead of own. I'll remember. Then he went inside, leaving Daniel alone on the porch. The old man sat back down and looked out at the land he had built with his own hands and Clara's wisdom. Somewhere in the house, he could hear her moving around, getting ready for bed. After 25 years of marriage, he knew the sound of her footsteps could track her movement through the rooms they had filled with love and laughter and life. In a few minutes, she would come out and sit with him for a while before they went to bed together, as they had done almost every night for a quarter century. They would not talk much. At their age, after all they had been through, words were often unnecessary. The door opened behind him, and Clara came out wrapped in a shawl against the evening cool. She sat down beside him without a word, and he took her hand. Her skin was soft now, the calluses of hard work smoothed by age, but her grip was still strong. They sat together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of their family sleeping inside the house built over buried chains. 3 generations under one roof, all of them free. All of them loved all of them, the living proof that redemption was possible, that broken things could heal, that choices mattered more than circumstances, that love, real love, the kind built on respect and patience and unwavering partnership, could transform everything. And 6 feet beneath where they sat, buried deep in Wyoming earth, an iron collar lay rusting in the darkness. A relic of cruelty and ownership, rendered powerless by time and love, and the simple choice of a woman who refused to let her past define her future. The next morning, Daniel walked Jonathan to the wagon that would take him to the train station. The young man's uniform was crisp and new, but his eyes had changed overnight. He had the look of someone who understood that courage came in many forms, that being a man meant more than being willing to fight. Grandpa, Jonathan said, gripping the old man's hand, I'll remember, about the collar, about choosing to free instead of own, about what really matters. Daniel nodded, his throat tight with emotion. Come home safe, boy. Your grandmother is already planning what she'll cook when you return. She's making a list. Jonathan smiled despite the tears in his eyes. I will. I promise. As the wagon pulled away, Clara came to stand beside Daniel. They watched together until Jonathan disappeared into the distance, heading toward a war that would test everything Daniel had just taught him. He'll be all right, Clara said quietly, taking Daniel's hand. He will. Daniel agreed. He's got good blood, yours and mine both. He knows what matters. They walked back to the house built over buried chains, to the life they had chosen, to the legacy that would outlive them both. And though neither said it aloud, they both knew that this was what they had been building toward all along. Not just a ranch, not just a family, but proof that people could change, that systems of cruelty could be defied, that one person's choice to do the right thing could ripple outward through generations. The collar was buried, the woman was free, and the legacy they built together would endure long after both of them had returned to the earth that held their secrets. Because freedom once truly given and truly chosen could never be taken away again. And love, the kind built on respect and partnership and unwavering choice, was stronger than any iron collar ever forged.